Okay. Okay. Welcome everyone to today's local adjudication panel. I believe we're trying to keep as much as we can with the same people in the committee that were last time. So unless there's any objections, I was going to remain as chair, and I'd like to welcome Councillor Sain, who's joined us as replacement for Councillor Petts, who was on the original panel. Again, I don't know, do we want to introduce ourselves? Are we happy that we know all each other? I'll kind of paraphrase some of the procedure if you're happy with that. For the benefit of Councillor Sain, who obviously wasn't on the first hearing, we are here to look at the outlines of an allegation made to us as a panel by the monitor. We sent away to do some further investigations. Both the subject member and the people who made the complaint are in attendance. Other than that, I'm happy for the monitoring officer to give another report that we've all seen, all had sight of the report, but if you'd like to brief us a little bit more. Sorry, John.
Can I just clarify one point that's slightly confused in my mind? The monitoring officer, were you also the investigating officer, Mark?
Yes, I did. Indeed, I was, and I am here today in the capacity of investigating officer.
Okay, so if I've not forgotten anything or done any wrong procedural ones, I'm sorry to welcome Chris, who's on the line via Zoom. I'll hand over to Mark.
We are short of Mr. Bullock at the moment, but you're otherwise correct and okay to go carry on.
Simon did email his apologies in advance about 2 weeks ago.
Okay, so we're all core, everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So as I just clarified, I'm actually here in the capacity of investigating officer. If at any point I need to transform myself into the monitoring officer, I will let you know. So, members of the panel, let me start with a couple of quotations from the LGA's guidance on the Model Code of Conduct, which I think are pertinent to these allegations. And the allegations, you will recall, arose from a debate that took place between members in a private session of full council on the 13th of July 2021. So the first point relates to respect for others in relation to the right to freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. This is a qualified right, meaning that the rights of the individual must be balanced against the interests of society. The LGA comments, freedom of expression is protected more strongly in some contexts than others. In particular, a wide degree of tolerance is accorded to political speech. Article 10 protects the right to make incorrect but honestly made statements in a political context, but it does not protect statements that the publisher knows to be false. Political expression is a broad concept and is not limited to expressions of or criticism of political views, but extends to all matters of public administration, including comments about the performance of public duties by others. In relation to its own model code, and equally relevant to our own insofar as the provision relating to respect for others is concerned, the LGA further comments, the provision of the code is not intended to stand in the way of lively debate in local authorities. Such discussion is a crucial part of the democratic process. Differences of opinion and the defence of those opinions through councillors' arguments and public debate are an essential part of the cut and thrust of public life. Councillors should be able to express their opinions and concerns in forceful terms. Direct language can sometimes be appropriate to ensure that matters are dealt with properly. The code is not intended to stifle the expression of passion and frustration that often accompany discussions about local authority business. It is only fair to add, of course, that the LGA also comments that gratuitous personal comments do not fall within the definition of political expression. So turning to the allegations in this particular case, you will recall that there are essentially two: that the subject member was aggressive and abusive in language and behaviour, and that the subject member lied to the meeting in stating that opportunity had existed prior to the meeting of full council for members to suggest additions to the list of buildings included in the bid for the Salix decarbonisation grant. And in so doing, the subject member had breached obligations 3.1 to provide leadership, 3.2 to show respect for others, 3.6 bringing the authority or himself into disrepute, and 3.12 not to intimidate a complainant. I will deal with the allegations in turn. With regard to the allegation of aggressive and abusive language and behaviour, the complainants themselves have described this as the lesser of their concerns. Whether someone is aggressive or abusive is often a matter of subjective judgment. As the panel, you are required to consider the evidence in an objective manner. So let us consider, what does aggressive mean? The Cambridge Dictionary defines it as behaving in an angry and violent way towards another person. Abusive is defined by the same authority as using rude and offensive words. The complainants have offered no specific examples of words or gestures that might be construed as aggressive or abusive, as those terms are objectively defined. Reflecting on the subject member's contribution to the debate, and many people here witnessed it, the panel should consider whether it was typified by anger, violence, and rude and offensive language, or by forcefulness, passion, and perhaps indeed frustration. If you incline towards the latter view, then you should reject the allegation and find that there has been no breach of obligations 3.1, 3.2, and 3.12. Turning to the more serious allegation that the subject member lied to the meeting, let me remind you of the LGA's comment with regard to Article 10 of the Convention rights. Article 10 protects the right to make incorrect but honestly made statements in a political context, but it does not protect statements that the publisher knows to be false. And of course, the essential quality of a lie is that it is, again courtesy of the Cambridge Dictionary, something you say that you know is not true. There are therefore two tests to be considered. Was the statement untrue? And if so, did the subject member know it to be untrue? Whether the allegation that the subject member lied is proven depends on whether he knew his statement that members had the opportunity to suggest changes to the list of buildings was untrue. And for that to be the case, the statement would have to be, in fact, untrue. The evidence suggests that the statement was not untrue. There had indeed been opportunities prior to the meeting of full council for suggestions to have been made for additions to the list of buildings. Members could have asked a question in the meetings of the Executive Advisory Group as to which buildings were included in the bid for the grant. They knew that a bid had been submitted and that it included provision for the corporate stock, a phrase that has been described not unjustly, as meaningless. Perhaps so. In which case, would one not ask what it meant? The investigating officer's suggestion that members might ask that question has been characterised as nonsense. Not so. It is certainly my experience that members ask questions. They are right to do so. That is part of their function. Indeed, a recent meeting of a local assessment panel concluded that there was no case to answer because the subject member asked a question. And that is what members do. How then, in this case, is it nonsense to suggest that members might have asked a question? The possibility of adding further buildings to the list could have been raised when the papers for the executive meeting held on the 1st of June 2021 were published. Although the item was considered in private, the mover of the amendment of full council, who happens to be one of the complainants, was privy to the report by established custom and practice of supplying the papers to the leaders of the minority groups, and could have asked the question either of the portfolio holder or the relevant officers. The matter could then have been dealt with at the meeting of the executive. The investigating officer's report shows, in response to the specific questions raised by this panel when it met as a local assessment panel, that the amendment raised at full council was itself invalid, given that it required a decision not within the remit of full council to give, and that the buildings that were its subject did not meet the grant criteria. The complainants have stated that this is irrelevant in the context of the allegations. That may well be the case, but had the possibility of adding further buildings to the list been explored when the opportunities arose prior to the meeting of full council, you would not now have this meeting before you to adjudicate. In conclusion on this point, there was, as the subject member stated, opportunity before the meeting of full council to have raised the question of additional buildings. He cannot have made the statement, knowing it to be false, as it was, the evidence suggests, not false. It was a true statement. In making a true statement, the subject member cannot have brought the authority and himself into disrepute. If you concur with that view, you should reject both the allegation that the subject member lied and any suggestion that he breached obligation 3.6. And finally, Chair, if I may, a word on a matter which, if not addressed, could well run the risk of bringing the authority into disrepute. The complainants, in their response to his report on findings, have stated that the investigating officer has implied or given the impression that it is acceptable to tell lies in a private meeting. This, I regret to say, is an egregious statement for the following reasons. The investigating officer had concluded that there had been no lie. And even if there had been a lie, the investigating officer was considering the impact of that lie with reference to the strict wording of obligation 3.6, a manner conducting themselves in a manner which could reasonably be regarded as bringing his or her office or the authority into disrepute, with the stress on the word reasonably, and had concluded that the impact would be lower in a private meeting than if the lie had been stated in a public meeting. That is not a condonation of lying, which is unfailingly to be reprehended. The panel is asked to put on record its rejection of the statement made by the complainants in this respect. That concludes my address, Chair. I'm of course happy to take questions in accordance with the procedure.
Chair, sorry, did you consider item 2? Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 1 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 1 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 1 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item 2 is the one that was raised by the complainant. Item because I've just realised that we've been carrying on.
Chair, having started in public, we need to proceed in public.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for your report, Mark. Have any of the members of the panel got any questions?
Chair, in accordance with the procedure, item 8, the complainants may question the investigating officer.
Okay, no problems. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Yes, Councillor Franks.
Thank you, Chair. Only probably one question. There may be a follow-up depending on the answer to it. The complaint, I'm referring to the complaint that the member did not display leadership, did not treat other members with respect, and brought his office into disrepute. Given that there were more than 50 witnesses to the event, I wonder if the investigating officer could explain to us why he didn't interview any of them to establish whether any of them agreed that there had been a lack of leadership, that there had been a lack of respect, and that it did bring the office into disrepute.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I can answer that. Frankly, I don't think that 50 subjective opinions would have been helpful in determining this matter. Some people would no doubt have sympathised with the complainants and felt that perhaps the behaviour had been disrespectful. Others would have said that the subject member was perfectly within his rights to respond forcefully to an amendment which, if passed, could have compromised the receipt of £7.2 million worth, I think it is, of grant funding. Those are subjective judgments. What I was keen to do was to examine whether there was evidence of a breach of those obligations arising from allegations of aggressive and abusive behaviour by an objective standard. And as I have said in my presentation, and I believe the independent person has commented previously, there were no specific examples of bad language, offensive name calling, or anything that you would reasonably classify as being abusive.
Thank you. If I could just follow that up briefly. The fact that 2 Labour members came up to me and apologised for his behaviour after the meeting would suggest that there were members present who did find it offensive. And I frankly don't accept your reason for not interviewing any of the other 50-odd witnesses that were there. Indeed, you witnessed it yourself. So there has to be a better reason. Your investigation needs to stand up to examination. And I would suggest to you that it doesn't, on the grounds that there were no witnesses interviewed at all.
The fact that or the comment that 2 Labour members approached the complainant following the meeting was not mentioned in the original complaint. It was raised subsequently as part of the response to the findings. Therefore, I can't really comment on that. But again, those would have been subjective judgments. And again, I will repeat, it is necessary to establish that there has been objective evidence of abuse or aggressive behaviour in order for the allegation to be justified.
Okay, so going down our little bits, we can. You get a chance.
3 questions. First of all, the whole of the accusation of lying is on the complainants have made the complaint on the grounds that they didn't know about the buildings what were in there. That's what the argument was about, full council. So just so we're very clear, what was said at the council meeting, you've had opportunities in the past to alter this list of buildings. That's recorded. That's the gist of the complaint. Are the minutes available for the June the 1st executive if the panel requires them?
The private decision sheet would certainly be available.
Thank you. And on that private decision sheet is a list of buildings.
I'm not aware that it goes into that level of
No,
detail.
what we're spending the money on and everything.
It was certainly in the report. It was detailed in the report, yes.
And so the statement that opportunities were made available beforehand, Councillor Franks would have a copy of that report on June the 1st, 6 weeks before the council meeting.
By custom and practice, the report would have been provided to the leader of the Liberal Democrat.
Well, what we're doing here today then? That's not a question for you.
Anything further, Tom?
No.
Oh, so John?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a point of information, if I may, Mark, and that is documents which were released by custom and practice to the Leader of the Opposition under those circumstances of a private meeting, are they confidential and not to be shared with other members of his group?
Yes, they are treated as if they are confidential papers. So it would have been necessary for the leader himself to have raised the matter if he felt that there was something that he wanted changed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. It goes through basically people either being called as witnesses and questions, so rather than go right the way through them until we potentially retire. Is there anyone else who needs to say anything?
Can I suggest that Mr. Fogler may have a view?
Yes, sorry. Chris, if you'd like to, as me being really rude, and joining on our meeting, please.
Sorry, Chair, we seem to be going off the procedure just a little bit. Yeah. Can we just make sure we stick to it, please? So we've reached the stage of point 11 on the procedure, which is the investigating officer may call any witnesses. Have we got any witnesses, Mr. Turner?
I have no witnesses to call, Chair.
Okay, apologies. So number 12, complainant may question the witnesses, but we won't have that. 13, subject member may question witnesses, but we won't have that. 14, panel may question witnesses. Nope. So 15, investigating officer asks further questions of the witness to clarify any points. Okay, 16, subject member or their representatives done her case, which I think Mr. Shaw, Councillor Shaw feels he's done. No, I haven't done that. Okay, so are we at 16? The subject member will present their case in relation to the investigation officer's findings and whether she or he feels he has breached the code.
Yeah, all I can say is I agree with most of the findings what are down here, what the investigation officer's done. I don't believe, I'm very passionate, but there's a difference between passion and anger. It's become very clear in the report that the claim that they'd never seen the building, never seen the list of the buildings was available just by questions being asked on at least 2 occasions, June the 1st especially, when the main complainant had a copy of what was going to the executive. At any time he could have asked for that list. At any time the members of the Climate Change Working Party could have asked for the list. The 2 buildings what were proposed, we wouldn't even been allowed to do because they weren't corporate buildings at the time. So we wouldn't have been allowed to do those buildings. So the amendment, what was made on the night, was, as far as I said it on the night, and I'll say it again, I believe was just a political amendment, playing political games on the night, and they were playing political games with a £7 million grant we could have lost if by mistake we'd have accepted that amendment. And I weren't prepared to lose £7 million towards carbon reduction in this town. I still believe to this day it was a game being played by the Leader of the Opposition, and the Leader of the Opposition is proved in these papers, you either believe your officers or you don't, had that information on June the 1st, and he could have asked at that meeting on June the 1st for further inclusions into that. I'm not saying we could have done those inclusions because those buildings are not corporate stock. But to stand up on the night and move an amendment, knowing, and I believe it did, to this day, he still did know that we couldn't have accepted it, because it's in this report as well, and it was in one of the reports, that if we'd have accepted that, we could have lost all the grant. I think that was foolish, no respect for the people of Luton at all, no respect for the jobs the officers had done, and I am passionate about climate change, and I wasn't going to allow a very foolish amendment made just for political reasons to derail all the work we've done. And the report is actually clear, it backed up everything I said. So how can it be a lie when I said on that night, you have had opportunities to change this list? And it's clear in here, I didn't write this, your officers wrote it, he had the opportunity minimum of June the 1st, forget the climate change working parties, but he had that opportunity on the night. It's now in black and white, he had that opportunity. So it can't be like, how can I tell a lie when I'm telling the truth that the officers, that the members had the opportunity to change it? You know, it's either you believe your officers or you don't. And it's all now in black and white.
Thank you, Councillor Shaw.
I have no questions for the subject member, Chair.
Councillor Shaw, yes, given that the papers were confidential, we've just established that point, then in what way do you think that Councillor Franks could raise the wider issues to what was on the list? Because clearly the authority occupies some premises which are rented, or they rent out premises, or whatever. There is clearly a mixed stock.
At the executive on June the 1st, Hazel is very generous with Councillor Franks. I'm not saying I'd be as generous. The Leader of the Council is very generous with him, allows him to ask questions continually at the executive. So he could have asked them there, but he could have asked the officers any time between June the 1st and that council meeting, any time at all. Even though they're in yellow pages, the officers would have to sit down with the Leader of the Opposition and talk to them about any questions they ask. Councillors, David Franks has been on this council for 40 odd years. He never had a problem asking questions before, but all of a sudden he has a problem asking questions. You know, all I can say is either a political game being played, or he chose not to read his agenda and not to bother asking the questions. It can only be one or the other, because all the information was there for him to read or ask questions on.
Yes.
Yeah, Councillor Shaw, I have another question. You refer to Councillor Franks as raising these issues for political gain. My question really is, what would Councillor Franks, or indeed his party, benefit from raising it and potentially sabotaging the grant?
Buildings, the report actually said corporate stock. So these two buildings are no longer corporate stock. And Councillor Franks had read that. I assume, after all these years of experience, that he'd read the reports and it was about corporate stock, and he tried to put 2 non-corporate buildings, that was what the amendment was about, strange enough, both in Liberal wards, into the carbon reduction programme.
Anyone else? Right. From my angle as chair, obviously I'm part of the Liberal Democrat team, and Tom says it was political. Now I can tell you it was me that brought it up at one of our group meetings. Again, I think I said it on the night, and we have a difference perhaps here. I worked at one of the buildings, and when I saw it on our group meeting papers, I said to our group meeting, as I do, could we not add to it? And our general suggestion was that that would be a good idea. So I don't see that we did do it as a political. With hindsight of this, and people at the meeting were perhaps saying we were naive if there had been a process before that. But the first time, myself, as the person that actually brought it forward, and not David as our leader, which is when I stood up at the council meeting at the time, because I felt that David was being wrongly put forward as the perpetrator of this amendment when it was me. Because of my input with one of the 2 centres. And so if I'd done it wrong, which I think at the night, one of the councillors, I'm not going to remember his name, stood up and said, I think you've done it the wrong way, Councillor Chapman, because I was quite passionate. So just from my angle, I think there was passion on both sides. I would reject Tom's idea that it was a political stunt. I would put forward the suggestion that we as the Liberals talked in our group. I said something that the other people in the committee. Yes, but is because I'm not part of that committee, and the word corporate stock is used a few times to be very vague. For me personally, it's the second time I've been on the council. Corporate stock would include any building the council owns. Now I know we've given it to a charity, but I would still have thought that's our building. So it was a genuine request by the Liberal group to try and include 2 buildings. Again, just a personal thing. On the night, I did think it could have been easily dealt with by saying, we can't do that, Councillor Chapman or the Liberal group, but we'll add it to the next time, which was vaguely suggested, but now we're saying not. So either way, I just think that to say it is a political stunt is unfair. And I just want to put that background to why it came to the full council.
To be argumentative and everything else, I would normally say after what you've just admitted, you shouldn't be in the chair of this panel. But I'm not. I'm quite happy for you to carry on as the chair of this panel. But because officially, you've just admitted that you were part of the discussion and everything else, and it was your idea. But I'm quite happy for it to carry on. As far as I'm concerned, this is still political games going on today. And I can't, no one's done anything to convince me to back away from that. Nobody.
Yeah, I can't. Well, I'm quite happy because I'm always upfront and open. That when I was made chair in the last meeting, I did think it was a surprise, but we're all involved with the actual meeting because we were all at the full council, and it's more about what was said at the full council. I was just pointing out your suggestion that outside of the full council, we were trying to be political, or David was trying to be political, which is why I stood up to say, no, if you're going to say we were being political, which I don't believe we were, it was me that suggested it, and possibly with the suggestion from the notion we've got now, but I wouldn't have had access to that. And corporate stock to me as a councillor would be, that's most of all of council buildings, but that's just a side issue. I just didn't want to put over that it was David kind of political stunt. I don't think it was a political stunt, Tom, in all honesty. Well, no, it wasn't. I don't think it was because I put it forward. Thank you.
Yes, if I'd suggest that we perhaps move on from this point, which is really not relevant to the complaint.
Apologies. We'll move on. Okay. 21. We, as a panel, can call any witnesses again, but that's not happening. 22, further questions in order to clarify? That's Tom, subject member. Thank you very much, Tom. Independent persons again. I'm very much aware of Chris is sitting on the end of the line. I imagine that would be before we will retire is where it's the last one. So it's 22. So 24, subject member sum up his or her case.
Sorry, Chair.
Yes.
Point 23, the independent person may ask questions of the investigating officer, subject member and any witnesses. So the independent person hasn't had the opportunity to ask anyone any questions yet. So
Okay.
that should really be put to them.
I apologise. So we're on to number 23. The independent member may ask questions of the investigating officer of the subject member. So that's where we were at, to try and bring Chris in. Apologies, Chris. My mistake.
That's okay, Chair. Don't worry. If I had any questions, they would have been addressed by particularly John Jones before. So at this stage, I don't have any questions of any of the participants.
Thank you very much, Chris. 24, the subject member may sum up, which we've done. 25, the independent person will give his views to the panel.
Yes, sorry, subject member gets this case to sum up. So questions from the subject member, presentation from the subject member, summary by the subject member. You haven't given Councillor Shaw that opportunity. It may be that he said everything.
No, he did.
Apologies, keeping my head down.
All right, no problems. So that's that one. The independent person give his views to the panel. The panel must take into account the views of the independent person before reaching a decision.
Do we not get an opportunity to sum up our case?
On my list, there is not one. I could seek guidance from.
No, Chair, it's not part of the procedure. I suppose if we're sticking strictly to the procedure, then the answer is no, you don't get an opportunity to sum up your case. Unless the monitoring officer has a different rule on whether that would be fair, whether that's a flaw in procedure. But if we're sticking to procedure, no opportunity for the complainants to sum up.
I would have no objections doing what you want, but all I've got to say is any other appeal system, I would have the final word, same as it was a benefits appeal, personnel appeal or anything.
Thank you for that, Tom. So as I understand it, Councillor Shaw said that Councillor Franks could have a say now, but he would like the final say, which we would be going outside of our procedure. But are we happy with that as a...
Could I suggest again that in fact the views of the independent person are given to the panel as to whether they think that 3.1, 3.2, 3.6 and 3.12 they may well have a view.
I suggest, Chair, that we invite Councillors Franks and Wynne to sum up their view, although it isn't in the procedure, because I think the procedure conceives that the complainants will not generally be present at the hearing. And we might want to revise that. I've already made one revision to enable the complainants to question the investigating officer if they are in the room at the time. We may need to go further than that in order to make sure that there is complete transparency. But then Councillor Shaw, as subject member, should have the right of reply, and then we move to the independent person. The independent person is the last person you should hear before you retire to make your decision.
Thank you very much for that clarification. So I'm sure we are all clear, but so I am. Complainant is going to make representations. Councillor Shaw will make representations. We'll hear the independent person and then we'll retire. Are we happy with that? Because I am. Yep. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, I won't delay you too long with this. The first thing I have to say is that Councillor Shaw stating that adding the additional buildings, the fact that adding the additional buildings would have jeopardised the grant was not, of course, in the executive committee report, because at that stage, no one knew whether there was ever going to be a suggestion of adding other buildings. There was absolutely nothing in the I checked the executive report, and in fact this morning I went through it for not for this reason but for another reason, and in fact there was absolutely nothing in it at all to suggest that changing the list of buildings would invalidate the grant. I accept that it may have done, but I didn't know that, and the executive report certainly didn't tell me that. The executive report was given to me, and as all executive reports are, in confidence. I have always respected that confidence, and I hope I always will respect that confidence. On that basis, I was not able to discuss the list of buildings with my Liberal Democrat colleagues until they received the agenda for the full council meeting, where the list was reproduced. That was the first that they knew about it. The list was not available to non-executive members apart from me until the agenda for the full council meeting was published. There is ample evidence that, in fact, no, let's put this a different way. It's perfectly possible for Councillor Shaw to have explained at the full council meeting that accepting the amendment would invalidate the whole grant. I didn't know that until he explained it, but it would have been perfectly possible for him to have explained it in reasonable, rational, sensible language, without the aggression and without the personal insults that accompanied it. But he chose instead to rant. And that really is the chief reason for the complaint. Any normal, rational person could have explained that in a calm and measured way. That wasn't the way the message was delivered. Thank you.
Yes, Councillor Wynne.
Yes, I've sat back here and listened to the events. As the panel will understand, I'm part of the Climate Advisory Group, and in order to put this into context, I would like the panel to understand that actually, as a member of that group, I very much respect the leadership that Councillor Shaw has taken in that Climate Advisory Group. However, any assertion that says that we were given the opportunity or had the opportunity to ask about the list of buildings that were in this so-called corporate stock at the advisory group is completely wrong. It was dismissed within a matter of perhaps 2 minutes in amongst the first one of those climate change meetings. At the subsequent climate change meeting, Councillor Shaw merely repeated the statements which David Franks has referred to as a tirade. And the truth is that climate change group, we didn't even know the basis on which any grant would be allocated or not. We didn't know anything of the rules. In fact, when the list was made available for us at full council, which was the first time I ever knew anything about it, my first question was, why wasn't the Inspire part of the grant application? Because that must be the biggest user of energy and the biggest need of a heat source anywhere in Luton with the heating of the swimming pool. So I actually did feel, and still do, that Tom's allegation that I did not do my job properly as a Liberal Democrat councillor within his climate change group was unjustified. And I again would say, just as Councillor Franks has done, that A reasonable explanation was all that was needed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Shaw. Thank you, Councillor Shaw. We are on to the independent member now, unless anyone's got any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Due to some technicality, I didn't hear anything that Councillor Shaw said then, although I have had the previous speakers.
I read it out, Chair. It takes 2 seconds. It is not correct, however, to state that the first opportunity that non-executive members had to comment on the proposals was at full council on the 13th of July. That opportunity was available prior to and at the meeting of the executive on the 1st of June. I stood up at the council meeting in July and said, you have had opportunities before to look at this list. David says I'm telling lies by saying that. So I'm lying, the officers are lying, everyone's lying. But it's in black and white. The officers have got the evidence that he had the opportunity on June the 1st to ask them those questions.
Thank you, Councillor Shaw. Sorry I missed that. I don't know what went wrong with the system at that stage. Chair, if I may, I'll go back to the fundamental complaint and go through the elements of that and my views as an independent person about the two main elements of the complaint. And the first one is about the language. In fact, to state the complaint, Councillor Shaw responded angrily at the full council meeting, and he continued in an aggressive and grossly abusive manner. Those are very strong words in terms of a description of behaviour, to say someone continued in a grossly abusive manner. And yet, having been asked for examples, and the monitoring of the investigating officer has made the very clear point about what is perception by some people may not be accepted by other people. Having been asked for examples and not providing, the complainants have, if you like, walked away from that element of the complaint. And it cannot be right, it cannot be appropriate for complainants to say, well, if you ask someone else what words were used, then they might tell you, but they don't themselves supply any evidence or any leads as to that particular part of the complaint. And therefore, from a very practical point of view, I would say that the first part of the complaint should not be considered to breach the code of conduct in any way. The second part, of course, is about the allegation that Councillor Shaw, subject member, has lied. And looking at the timetable for what took place. The report from the investigating officer has, if you like, brought a timetable to our attention in terms of an executive advisory group meeting on the 2nd of February being the first occasion when the grant applications were mentioned, not giving the details, but that's back in February. And then there was a further mention in the next advisory group on the 20th of April. Again, no information, no details were available or given, and no information as to the outcome of that. But it is made evident in the report that the executive meeting of the 1st of June did have the buildings included for the first time. In other words, details were known. The complaint is about what the subject member said on the 13th of July at the full council. And although at one stage he is said to have said that it had been on the agenda of the exec 6 months ago, to say it was on the agenda of the exec is probably not exactly accurate, but it was within the system for 6 months, because you can go back to February. I think a reasonable person would say to themselves, yes, the details were not known at that stage, but for someone 6 months later to say, well, the information was in the system, was available, then that is not considered in anyone's book, I don't believe, as a downright lie, as trying to mislead the council. I think that it is not being specific with what was available, and I can understand that at a meeting, trying to recall dates, etc., is not always an easy job. I don't envy any of you councillors trying to debate subjects which are contentious and you have to get your facts so correct. But it is, and it must be difficult. But I don't think it would be for a reasonable person to say that that was a deliberate lie that Councillor Shaw said at that stage. So for those reasons, I do not believe also that the code of conduct in this respect as well has been breached. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chris. Okay, so if I've done my ticking right, we are now at the stage when it says we can retire, whether it would be easier if I can ask the subject members and the complainants to retire because there's just 3 of you and we'll stay in here.
Don't forget, Chair, you need to move the motion to move into private.
Thank you very much.
Councillor, are you making that motion now to go into private?
Yes, I can make that motion now to go into private.
Yeah. Agreed?
Members, and then agree, and then you go into private.
Yeah.
Whether the public interest outweigh the...
Okay, so I'll formally ask, are we all in agreement that we go into private?
Yes.
Agreed, thank you.
Hi, Chris. It's Matt Hussey, Democratic Services Officer. Obviously, we've moved into private, so you need to leave the Teams meeting. But members have agreed that if you rejoin us at 3:20, and then I'll readmit you. Okay.
Lovely. Okay, 3:20.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
We want to, but there's no note about the last round. You'll hear me, we have to do that. So we're going to play that microphone. You would know the story and stuff. Right. So the recommendation officer, but there is no evidence of restriction. What you said just now, and that is that language. I've got to agree. I mean, for me, Can you hear us, Chris?
Yes, indeed, I can.
Waiting for everyone to get in. I think we're all there now. Okay, thank you for your time. Sorry it took as long as it did. Okay, so as chair, I've got the time to tell you our recommendations, and we have looked at the recommendations given to us to concur with investigating officer that there is no evidence of a breach of obligations of 3.1, 3.2, 3.12 of the Code of Conduct for members, and accordingly dismiss that allegation. That was 2.1. Number 2.2 was to consider the findings of the investigating officer in respect to the allegations of a breach of obligation 3.6 of the Code of Conduct of members, and to determine, in the light of evidence, the conduct of the subject member can be reasonably regarded as bringing his office or authority in disrepute, and we reject that one. And the third one, to determine if the allegations in respect of the obligation 3.6 is upheld, what sanctions, and that one again we dismiss. So all of the three recommendations put to us as the panel, we have accepted and have dismissed the complaint, therefore.